Cortona's frescoes capture the very essence of Apollo's triumph.
Indeed, a masterful display, Your Highness.
The ultramarine must be applied with the lightest touch to achieve the desired depth.
Like so, Maestro.
Excellent, the light catches it perfectly.
Thank you, Maestro.
Stop scrolling right now. What if I told you there was one city in 1640s Europe that made every king, every emperor, every nobleman absolutely furious with jealousy? Not because of military power, not because of wealth, because of something so beautiful, so culturally superior, that it made their own kingdoms look barbaric. This is Florence in 1640. And what they created here was so magnificent that Europe spent centuries trying to copy it, and failing. Here's what nobody tells you. While Europe was destroying itself in religious wars, one Italian city discovered the secret to making culture more powerful than armies. They turned art into a weapon, beauty into political power, creativity into empire, and every European court was desperately trying to figure out how they did it. Picture this insanity. French nobles traveling hundreds of miles just to see Florence, then returning to Versailles angry because their own palaces looked primitive in comparison. German princes hiring Florentine artists at any price because their own courts seemed culturally backwards. Spanish royalty literally begging Medici family for cultural advice because Florence made Madrid look like a provincial town. This is cultural superiority that made empires feel inadequate. What I'm about to show you is the most beautiful city in human history, at its absolute peak. But more than that, I'm going to reveal the secret technique Florence used to make every other European culture feel jealous and inferior. Here's what's going to blow your mind. Florence didn't just create beautiful things. They created a complete cultural system that made beauty seem effortless while other cities struggled to achieve even basic sophistication. They made cultural excellence look natural, while their competitors looked like they were desperately trying to catch up. That's the secret that made Europe jealous. The 30 Years' War is devastating Europe. Cities are burning, populations are starving, civilization is collapsing. But Florence is entering the most beautiful period in human history. The Medici family had figured out something no other European power understood. Cultural superiority creates more lasting power than military conquest. While other rulers built bigger armies, the Medici built better artists. While other courts focused on gold, Florence focused on genius. While other cities competed through force, Florence competed through beauty. And it worked so well that Europe is still trying to copy their techniques 400 years later. Walk with me into a Florentine art workshop in 1642. This isn't just art creation, this is cultural warfare. Master painters teaching techniques that create beauty other European artists literally cannot achieve. Sculptors working marble in ways that make French and German art look clumsy. Architects designing buildings so elegant that visiting foreigners feel physically inferior. These workshops aren't just making art. They're manufacturing European envy. But here's what made European nobility truly furious. Even wealthy Florentine merchants lived in palaces more beautiful than royal residences in other countries. A random Florentine businessman had better taste than German emperors. Here's the genius part nobody talks about. Florence didn't just hire great artists. They created a system that produced cultural excellence automatically. Artistic education starting in childhood meant every Florentine citizen understood beauty. Patron competition meant every wealthy family tried to outdo each other culturally. Guild systems meant even craftsmen created things more elegant than royal treasures elsewhere. They turned their entire city into a cultural excellence machine. By 1645, European courts were panicking, French ministers writing reports about Florentine cultural superiority, German princes offering massive bribes to steal Florentine artists, Spanish diplomats studying Medici family techniques for creating effortless elegance. Here's something that's going to blow your mind about Florentine cultural dominance. Michelangelo had been dead for 76 years, but his students were still creating art that made contemporary European artists look like beginners. The techniques he developed were so advanced that Florence was living in an artistic future while Europe struggled with artistic past. Walking through Florence in 1640 was like experiencing what culture would become centuries before anyone else achieved it. But the Medici discovered something revolutionary about human psychology. People will do their greatest work when they feel their creativity is genuinely valued, rather than just financially rewarded. Florentine patrons didn't just buy art. They participated in cultural creation. Picture the most sophisticated cultural environment in human history. Painters learning from sculptors, architects collaborating with poets, musicians inspiring mathematicians. Every creative discipline cross-pollinating with every other creative discipline. This wasn't just art production, this was cultural evolution happening in real time. And European courts couldn't figure out how to replicate it because they thought culture was something you purchased rather than something you cultivated. Step inside Palazzo Medici in 1643. This isn't just a residence, it's a cultural laboratory where European civilization's future is being designed. Libraries containing books other European scholars have never seen. Art collections that define what beauty means for centuries to come. But Florence's secret weapon wasn't just visual beauty, it was intellectual sophistication. Conversations happening in Florentine salons were decades ahead of intellectual discourse anywhere else in Europe. Scientific discoveries, philosophical insights, literary innovations, all emerging from cultural environments other cities couldn't create, even when they had more money. European intellectuals traveled to Florence not just to see art, but to participate in thinking that was literally more advanced than what was possible in their home countries. Here's what made European architects weep with envy. Florence had solved architectural problems that other cities didn't even know existed. Brunelleschi's dome techniques were still producing buildings that made contemporary European architecture look primitive. But the real secret was psychological. Florentines had cultural confidence that made everything they created seem effortlessly superior. They weren't trying to impress anyone, they were just naturally creating at a level other Europeans struggled to achieve, even when consciously attempting greatness. This effortless superiority was what drove European courts absolutely insane with jealousy. Even Florentine fashion made European courts look backwards. Silk techniques producing fabrics other European weavers couldn't replicate. Color combinations that made French and Spanish court dress seem clumsy. Elegant simplicity that made German and Austrian luxury look desperate. Here's something that's going to shock you. Florence used cultural superiority as diplomatic leverage. European ambassadors would arrive in Florence feeling powerful, then leave feeling culturally inferior and more willing to make diplomatic concessions just to maintain relationships with Florentine sophistication. Culture became more effective than military threats for achieving political objectives. This is soft power, perfected centuries before anyone understood the concept. Even Florentine gardens made European royal landscaping look amateur. Boboli gardens demonstrated landscape architecture that integrated art, nature, and human psychology in ways other European courts couldn't understand, much less replicate. But Florence's ultimate secret was integrating scientific discovery with artistic creation. Galileo's telescopes weren't just scientific instruments. They were artistic objects beautiful enough to display in palaces. Anatomical studies weren't just medical research. They were creating artistic techniques for depicting human beauty more perfectly. Mathematical principles weren't just abstract knowledge. They were creating architectural harmony other cities couldn't achieve. Science and art reinforcing each other to create cultural advancement impossible elsewhere. Florentine musical innovation was making European courts sound primitive. Opera techniques developed in Florence made traditional European court entertainment seem backwards. Musical compositions that required cultural sophistication to appreciate properly, meaning European courts often couldn't even understand what made Florentine music superior. Here's what made European economists furious. Florence was proving that cultural excellence generated more sustainable wealth than military conquest. Florentine banks were financing European royalty because cultural superiority created economic advantages that military power couldn't achieve. European merchants traveled to Florence, not just to buy goods, but to learn business techniques that integrated aesthetic sophistication with commercial success. Beauty was literally generating more profit than force. Florence had created educational systems that produced culturally sophisticated citizens automatically. Children growing up with artistic and intellectual training that prepared them for cultural excellence rather than just professional competence. European educators studying Florentine techniques because they couldn't figure out how Florence consistently produced more cultured human beings. Even Florentine religious art was making European churches look spiritually inferior. Catholic churches throughout Europe were commissioning Florentine artists because their own religious art seemed to provide less transcendent spiritual experiences. Protestant observers secretly admitting that Florentine Catholic art created more powerful religious feelings than Protestant spiritual practices. Religious beauty becoming more spiritually effective than theological arguments. Florentine literature was making European writing seem culturally backwards. Poetic techniques, philosophical insights, dramatic innovations that required cultural sophistication European courts didn't possess. European writers traveling to Florence, not just to study Italian, but to experience literary culture advanced enough to improve their own creative capabilities. Florence was creating technology so beautiful it functioned as art. Clocks that were sculptures, scientific instruments that were decorative objects, engineering solutions that achieved both practical and aesthetic perfection. European courts commissioning Florentine craftsmen because their own technology, while functional, lacked the aesthetic integration that made Florentine technology seem magically superior. By 1648, Florence was exporting culture more successfully than other European powers were exporting military force. Florentine cultural influence spreading throughout Europe, not through conquest but through voluntary adoption by people who recognized cultural superiority when they experienced it. Here's how Florence's cultural strategy changed European politics. Military alliances based on fear were being replaced by cultural relationships based on admiration. European courts competing to demonstrate their appreciation for Florentine excellence rather than their military capabilities. Diplomatic negotiations where cultural sophistication provided more leverage than economic or military threats. Florence proving that cultural soft power created more lasting international influence than hard power. Want to know something that's going to blow your mind about modern culture? Every technique for cultural influence that modern powers use, from Hollywood to fashion capitals to tech company design, was perfected by Florence 400 years ago. Cultural confidence, creating automatic superiority. Aesthetic integration, making functional superiority seem effortless. Educational systems, producing culturally sophisticated populations. Here's something that's going to change how you see your daily cultural choices. Every time you choose something because it's more aesthetically sophisticated, you're using Florence's cultural superiority technique. Every time you're impressed by someone's effortless style, you're experiencing what made Europe jealous of Florence. Every time you recognize cultural excellence that seems naturally superior to alternatives, you're understanding Florence's secret weapon. Florence's secret wasn't having more money or better artists. Their secret was creating cultural systems that made excellence seem effortless, while their competitors looked like they were desperately trying to catch up. Natural superiority versus obvious effort. Florence proved that cultural evolution works faster than military evolution. While European powers were perfecting techniques for destroying enemies, Florence was perfecting techniques for creating beauty that made enemies want to become friends. Cultural attraction creating more lasting influence than military conquest. This is why Florence's influence lasted centuries, while European military empires collapsed when their armies were defeated. Standing in Florence today, you can still feel the power of their cultural superiority strategy. Walk through the Uffizi and experience art that still makes contemporary culture seem primitive. Tour Renaissance palaces that still make modern luxury look desperate. Stroll through streets designed with aesthetic sophistication that modern urban planning can't achieve. But in 1645, this wasn't history. This was the living proof that culture creates more lasting power than politics, economics, or military force. Here's the ultimate truth about Florence's secret. They discovered that cultural excellence creates automatic superiority that doesn't require effort to maintain. Military power requires constant energy to sustain. Economic dominance requires continuous competition. Political control requires persistent enforcement. But cultural superiority, once achieved, it maintains itself through the voluntary admiration of everyone who experiences it. Florence's secret was creating beauty so naturally superior that Europe spent centuries voluntarily accepting Florentine cultural dominance because the alternative was acknowledging their own cultural inadequacy. That's why Europe was jealous. Not because Florence was trying to be better, because Florence was effortlessly, naturally, obviously better. And that kind of superiority is impossible to compete with because it's not based on defeating others, it's based on creating excellence that makes competition irrelevant. That's all for our journey through Florence's cultural dominance. But remember, every time you experience something so culturally sophisticated, it makes everything else seem inferior. You're feeling what made all of Europe jealous of one Italian city 400 years ago. If there's another moment when cultural excellence created international jealousy, another city that achieved effortless superiority through beauty, let me know in the comments, because Florence's lesson isn't about Italy or the Renaissance. It's about the eternal truth that excellence achieved naturally is more powerful than superiority achieved through effort. The secret that made Europe jealous lives on every day in every choice to create rather than compete, to build rather than defeat, to inspire rather than intimidate.